Hello, everybody out there in the internet. I'm Austin, and this is Zero Down Sessions. Today we're doing an author roundtable with the authors of Distributed Tracing and Practice, released earlier this year by O'Reilly. So, in no particular order, we're going to bring everyone else on. Jonathan Mace, Spoons, and Rebecca Isaacs. So say hi, everyone. You're on the internet.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
All right. So I the one time that I needed to have a copy of it to hold up, I don't actually have it. All right, Spoons has it. So that's the book that we wrote. And today we've got about an hour. And what I think we're going to do is we're just going to go around first and we're going to kind of introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about our background, how we came into this project, and talk just a little bit about what it was like writing it, some takeaways, some things that we think you should know. Maybe a little chat about distributed tracing in general at the end, and then we could also take questions from you out there in the audience. So if you have a question, please type in chat, and we'll put it up on the screen and we'll answer it. In addition, throughout the course of the stream, you'll be able to win a copy of the book. You will see this little thing pop up right down there. Right down, yeah, right below Spoons, kind of occluding his face a little. Sorry, Spoons. Yeah, just kind of stick the chair up a little.
Cool.
But you can go to this link, fill out a short form, and be entered for a chance to win. I think up to 5 copies. So, and that giveaway is generously sponsored by Lightstep, lightstep.com. Anyway, with that said, let's get going. So my name is Austin Parker. I was one of the authors on this book. I guess it was kind of my idea, or I was sort of the
For sure.
author slash project manager. And when I started this, I was I was a software engineer at Lightstep, and now I'm a developer advocate at Lightstep. Next, Jonathan, why don't you say hi? Tell us who you are.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Mace. I am a professor over in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. Distributed tracing is one of the areas of research that both myself during my PhD and my research group currently focuses on. I guess I've been working on this topic for like 8 years now, right since the very start of my PhD. So I bring in more of a research perspective on things. Yeah.
Cool.
I'll let you coordinate who can speak next, Austin.
Let's do Rebecca next.
Okay. I work at Twitter. I'm actually currently working on their tracing systems that can trying to find ways to extract more value from the tracing. That actually Twitter has been collecting traces since about 2014, so there's a long history there. Before Twitter, I was a user of tracing at Google, and before that, like Jonathan, I have mostly worked in the academic research community, and in fact, one of the first things I did in my research career was a tracing system. So I've done other things too, but I've actually worked quite a lot in this space.
Cool. And last but not least, Spoons.
Hi, I'm Spoons. I'm I'm one of Austin's coworkers at Lightstep. I'm the CTO and one of the founders there. My entrance to tracing, I guess, maybe is later than many of yours. I was an academic for a long time, but not in tracing. And I sort of came at this a little bit from an operational point of view and working with developers and SREs at Google, and sort of looking at what kind of solutions could help us, and eventually went on to form Lightstep based on some of the things that we learned.
Cool. Well, with that said, I guess let's talk about the book a little bit, right? So for those, maybe a good first question is for everyone that's kind of watching, and maybe you don't know what distributed tracing is. What if we try to define distributed tracing? I'll take a crack at it, right? So from my perspective, and this is I think what I really wrote about, is I look at distributed tracing from the perspective of how does this actually kind of impact my life as an engineer, right? As someone that writes code. And to me, distributed tracing really is at the core, it's a really effective way to represent the work done by, a computer program or a service in a network of other services, in a way that kind of answers a lot of the questions that you kind of have to figure out for your own, right? When I worked at my last job, we had a distributed system, platform as a service. It was a .NET platform as a service. And one of the biggest challenges was, when something broke with an individual request, where did it break? How do I find out what broke? And when I first learned about open tracing several years ago, it's like, oh, this is the answer to that question of like, here is a standard API and not only an API to sort of make it easier for me to program this in, but also a really good mental model for how to actually to talk about and communicate this problem of service-to-service interactions. Anyone else want to take a shot at it?
Happy to give it a go. My opinion on it is really that distributed tracing is about. Well, I guess maybe we can start by saying we all like to build up applications. But we like the idea of decomposing applications into small, manageable chunks. It makes it easier to develop applications, and it makes it easier to, evolve individual pieces. But eventually, you need to reason about the program as a whole. You need to understand its end-to-end behavior. You don't have to tightly couple all the pieces of your application, but you do need to get some sort of end-to-end understanding of what it's doing. So to me, distributed tracing is about getting that understanding. I think I take a broader view than just specific APIs like open tracing. I really think of it as any sort of information that you need that crosses the boundaries between multiple different services, multiple different processes, administrative domains. That is where distributed tracing comes in.
Cool. Anyone else want to follow up on that? Rebecca or Daniel? Probably off spoons. Seeing your actual name there is confusing me. Sorry.
I can fix it. The one thing I was thinking, not to disagree, but like the other way I think about it sometimes is in terms of a data structure, which is maybe kind of too low level in a lot of ways, but partly because you can do so many different things. Like the idea of having a data structure which enables those, I think, is kind of useful. Maybe the data structure is sort of the implementation behind what Jonathan's talking about, being able to reconstruct this bigger thing. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I would say, I think, I broadly agree with what everything else that you've all said, but I think it's the perspective, the end-to-end perspective across distributed machines that makes it. It's not a replacement for metrics or logging or any other kind of way of monitoring our systems. It's complementary, and I think it's a really important piece. And you can have really good metrics, you can have extensive logging, and you're going to miss stuff that you will see. There's definitely some overlap, but you will see more stuff when you start looking at traces. And I think that's easy to forget. People will say, well, I can figure out our service dependency graph by static analysis on the source code. Well, you can, kind of, but you're never going to have the insight into, what part of that graph is hot and what's cold unless you look at traces, just as an example.
No, I think that's a really good point, and something that, to actually kind of take it back a step, there was a tweet that I saw going around like last week, I want to say, and it was someone that actually was, what did it go? Oh, here it is. I'm reading a book on distributed tracing, and so far my main takeaway is that you should avoid building distributed systems if you can at all help it. And I don't want to like challenge the assertion specifically, but I would say, why, do we have any thoughts on like why is there? Because in my view, a distributed system, works pretty well actually. Like they're certainly, the difficulties in reasoning about them seem to me to be something that's just like related to tooling, right? Like if you can understand a monolith, you can probably also understand a distributed system. It's just that there's a bias towards tooling to make it easy to understand what's going on in a monolith. And I was wondering, does anyone else have thoughts on that? Like, is this really just we don't understand them because it's not how we're trained to think, or is it a sort of, I guess you would say, pipeline problem of the level, the amount of different things that can break causes it to be difficult the amount of things that can break leads you into a cycle of like, okay, everything is broken, and my tools to understand how everything is broken are also broken, so I'm not, instead of trying to fix that part of the cycle, it's just like, well, let's not do it at all.
Yeah, I think that idea of like what's broken is sort of important, right? Like before, you didn't have to worry about things failing independently, like it was either there or not there. And now we have the sort of bigger state space that you have to think about, right? Which is like, my part of the application is working, but maybe that one's not, or maybe that one's not. And those are just like things that I didn't have to consider before.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, sorry, Jonathan, do you want to go?
No, you had.
I was just going to say that in practice, the way that things can fail in production is actually really subtle and really complicated, and especially when you get control plane responses like timeouts and retries affecting what actually happens to the requests themselves. And it is, even with traces there to help you, it's seriously hard to debug distributed systems when they start misbehaving.
Mm-hmm.
In the spirit of quoting tweets, there's one that I really like, which is you've probably all seen it, the one where it's we moved our monolith to a microservice architecture so that every outage could be more like a murder mystery.
That tweet prominently featured in the book, by the way.
It did. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Made it in.
I want to bring this up from someone in the chat, Vastav05. If you start, it's getting cut off here, sorry, but if you start with a monolith, then your infrastructure and tooling will need to be redone when you eventually break into smaller parts. I think that is one of the reasons that monolithic applications don't get broken apart, because the cost of retooling is so high. And I feel like I've seen this professionally, at least in several places, where, even to add another wrinkle to it, it wasn't like, whenever you kind of have that moment of like, oh, we're going to break this up, then a lot of other ideas come in that maybe weren't there before. So it's like, I think the words DevOps transformation sort of embroil this concept of like, oh, now let's also move to Git flow, right? Or let's change from SVN or whatever. Let's kind of take our shopping cart, our DevOps shopping cart, and just push it down the aisle and sweep everything into it. And I think a lot of times, like, distributed tracing gets kind of caught up in that, right? Like, it becomes a buzzword that people are like, well, if we're going to do this, let's toss it all in there. And I think that goes to a problem that I hear from a lot of people, is that, oh, this is also hard. That distributed tracing is perceived to be very difficult. Now, I would like to think that we are combating that effectively through our wonderful text. But if anyone Yeah, Rebecca, Rebecca and Spoons are both probably good people to talk about this, right? Like, you all have worked on very large-scale tracing systems. Is it hard because it's hard, or is it hard
Rebecca
because
more
you make it hard?
recently? Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
I don't think it's hard.
See, there you go. Tracing, not hard. Put it on the cover.
There is scale. There are a number of moving parts. There's things like picking the right sampling rate. If you sample too high, things will fall over. If you sample too low, you won't be able to draw any meaningful conclusions from the aggregate traces. People have to have enough representation to understand what their service is doing, because one trace an hour, if you're handling 100,000 requests an hour, is probably, there's some chance it'll be anomalous, and you won't be able to say anything about what's going on from that one trace. I think the challenges of collection, storage, and subsequent processing of the set of traces that you have are just standard big data problems. I mean, I say big data. So I've worked at Google, which is enormous, and the tracing system there, it's tremendous that it works at all, simply because of the scale of Google. Twitter is much, much smaller relatively, but it's still a pretty big system with a pretty high request rate, and we have to work to keep the system functioning well. But I think in a lot of cases, the nice thing about tracing is, as your system gets smaller, the challenges of setting up a tracing system become smaller. And when it comes down to it, the data model for tracing is really, it's very simple. This, whole idea of traces and spans and tags, you can sort of approach it in a very incremental way and put in, the bare minimum of information, and then start to see what value you're getting from that information and gradually build it up. It's not like a sort of massive commitment to kind of rewrite all your software. It's not like that at all. And so I actually don't feel that it should be perceived as hard, and I don't this not very empathetic really, but I actually don't understand why it is. Maybe you guys can enlighten me.
Well, I think we can actually maybe spin off this, continue this question from the chat from the Developnik. The number one thing we're figuring out as a medium-sized business moving from a model to distributed is how to afford to do distributed tracing while keeping more than 2 days of data and sampling out 95% of traces.
Yeah, it is a data problem at some level, right? I guess maybe to me the thing that's like hard in it is somehow like it is a simple data model at the beginning, right? And I feel like a lot of the tension in the book is like trying to balance between like offering the simple advice that'll get you a long way, and like the stuff that's probably most interesting to the four of us, which is like the 5% at the end that's like super tricky and has some non-trivial answers, and it is fun in a lot of ways, but it's not necessarily the thing that you need to know first of all, right? And so I think from the point of view of adopting the system, like a lot of that is about like sharing just like these use cases that you can start with and that have a lot of value, and rolling those out across your teams, across your organization, so that you can get that value, and then kind of digging in further and seeing where the other kind of nuggets lie.
Yeah. So let's see. So we kind of, I guess, for the people watching that don't have it already, we kind of organized the book in sort of these, I would say, 3-ish sections, 3 or 4 sections. Yeah, 3 sections. And the first one is sort of, very micro scale, like you're a developer and you want to implement tracing. And then we have kind of this second bigger part on how to collect that telemetry, collect the trace data, get value out of it. And then the back half is very much like, here's sort of the past, present, and future almost, right? The theoretical underpinnings and the future of distributed tracing. So I would actually I'd be really interested in talking about the future first, as it were. There's two big projects I would say right now that are maybe a little tactical, but one is open telemetry, right, as a way to standardize both the representation of trace data and also to standardize sort of a framework for collecting trace data and dispatching it to different analysis systems. And then I think kind of a step beyond that is this moving away from head-based sampling to a variety of either tail-based sampling or dynamic sampling approaches. So for everyone else, like, one, thoughts on open telemetry. Good thing, bad thing, mediocre thing? Is that really what we need? Two, sampling. Like, are we moving towards this future of like your client is really almost dumb and it's just sending everything out all the time, and you've got all these layers of processing that determines like, oh, is it sampled, is it not sampled? What do you think?
I think that some of this discussion about open telemetry goes back to the previous point to do with why is tracing perceived as difficult. And one of the nice things about converging on standards for tracing is that it becomes less difficult because everybody starts talking about the same things. The concepts become established in people's minds, and so there's less of a burden to take up tracing. So I view it only as a good thing that we're moving in a direction where everything that goes into tracing is common, is shared, and is well understood. My perspective on tracing is that even today, there's still an enormous amount of effort that has to go into deploying tracing compared to the various other tools that you would use for monitoring metrics, for doing debugging, for profiling applications. The sort of naive example here would be like, how many of you know how GDB works versus how many of you have used GDB? Now I know this is a world away, but for tracing, how much do you need to understand the internals of tracing in order to use it? And I think that bar is a lot higher than for other tools. So personally, I think it's a nice thing that we're moving in a direction where you don't have to understand as many of the internals in order to use these tools, because that lowers the barrier to entry. And figuring out how to do sampling well without requiring manual intervention, without requiring carefully specifying your sampling policies, without the threat of the system blowing up because you've set some parameter wrong by a factor of 10. These are sort of interesting. It's the future I want to see.
Back there, Spoons, you want to chime in?
I think, I mean, obviously, I'm going to also agree, like, open telemetry is pretty great. And there's a lot of, I guess, to me, the downside is mostly just that there's a lot of work for those that are contributing to it, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but that, I think, is a great investment for the rest of us. I think the sampling question is kind of interesting because it comes up so early in a lot of conversations about tracing. I know that there's like a lot of impact that it can have, but it's sort of like, if you're talking about sampling before you're talking about like what you want to get out of tracing, that you're sort of skipping ahead in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of different things that you can do with that data, and the way that you sample it has to kind of be informed by those choices.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, as an example, if you're going to do dynamic sampling rates where you pick up only requests that are in your 99th percentile latency, for example, then you are making it not possible to use the data later to do sort of aggregate analysis of, what's the median latency across, all instances of this service. And certainly in a world like Twitter, which is very microservices heavy, I think it would not be valuable for us to start doing dynamic sampling. But a lot of teams in the company would really like to have that capability. And so I'm not sure this is a battle that I'm going to win, but that's okay. It's good that we're sort of fighting over how tracing can be, as useful as possible, rather than why should we have this at all? That's not even the conversation. And I also, with open telemetry, yes, absolutely agree with what the others have said. Yeah, it's the standardization is really important for the sort of long-term health and general usefulness of tracing for everybody.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question from the chat. I'll throw it up here. Mozuf. Sorry, I butchered your name. What is the best practice to implement tracing? Is it through instrumenting each application independently, or through Sidecar pattern, just building a single container and pass all application traffic through it? I have some opinions, but I'm sure everyone else does too.
I think you should say, Austin. We haven't heard from you much. Yeah,
I've been talking the entire time. My personal opinion, and I do try to write about this a little bit. Actually, I'll step back. I think there's something that you see in the world that I like to call the tyranny of demos. And the tyranny of demos is that you will go and see a demo, or you will go see a talk. Well, maybe you won't go see it anymore, but maybe you'll watch a video of a talk of like someone set up Jaeger or Zipkin, or they have this amazing tracing system, and you look at all the stuff, right? You see it's like these very fine-grained representation of a request, and you see, it's like, oh, I go search it, and I can do these cool, aggregations and group bys, and all this data is here, and it's fantastic. And then you're like, okay, cool, I want to do that. I want that. That's what I want. And so you go start implementing, and then you realize that the only actual way you can get that level of data and that level of granularity is through manual instrumentation of every single one of your services. And there's not really a shortcut here. And I think that's one of the things that causes like this perception of like, oh, this is hard. And like Rebecca, I actually fundamentally, I disagree with the assessment on like its basic nature, right? It's like saying logging is hard, right? Well, it might be or it might not be, but it's not something you get to debate the merits of. If you want to run software, you need logging or something like it, right? Now, it can just be, I'm printing out a couple strings of text, and that's fine. But conversely, if you go look at a log for, if you go look at a demo of like a log aggregation product, you're going to get the same thing, where it's like, oh, I can do all this cool stuff if I've gone through and I've made like really good structured logs statements, and I'm putting out these full rich events into a file or into a database. So what I think you should do is you should do both. Get started with, I think getting started with like sidecars is really handy. And I think there's a lot of things that you will probably always want to get out of a sidecar. I mean, container to container. Let's assume you're talking about Kubernetes here, right? So it can be very useful to know, like, what's my time on the wire between, app proxy A, app proxy B. But to actually get useful things that aren't going to be in that request, details about the runtime or the specific customer ID, or things you can only get through introspecting the code itself, then yeah, you're going to have some instrumentation of the application itself. As actually we talk about a little in the book, you need to make a strategy. you need to have a plan for how you do this in an iterative way, because you can't, if you go in expecting I'm going to sign up for some service and then I'm going to install this sidecar and I'm going to get exactly what they showed me, you're probably going to leave disappointed. What you can do is start by looking at the things that are easy to look at, find value in that, and then kind of iteratively enhance that instrumentation by instrumenting service to service to service.
So I quite like this point, and I think this question touches on something that's personally interesting, which is that the actual developer effort to do instrumentation is quite high, and because distributed tracing is so young, we don't have any tooling that you do have for so many other areas of software development that can at least aid in making the instrumentation process easier. I mean, we have our book, which is better than what we had before our book. But if you think about instrumentation is not hard. We have all agreed with this. Yet it is hard. It's a cumbersome process. So I personally view this as an interesting research question, which is what sort of tooling can we provide to actually make it easy for people to just go ahead and quickly identify how to propagate context through their program, how to identify the places where they should be measuring things, and what the effects of their instrumentation will be, without having to go ahead and run Twitter or something like that. That's quite interesting to me. And I'll happily talk at length about that, but I don't think that's the purpose of this. But you can follow me on Twitter, and you might hear more.
Yes, everyone's Twitters are right.
Yeah, bit of shameless self-promotion never hurt anybody.
Yeah, a little shame. Yeah. Ironic that the one person that works at Twitter doesn't have their Twitter handle. It's fine. I wouldn't use it unless I had to for work. Spoons, Rebecca, you all want to chime in on this one, or?
I was thinking back to the question a little bit itself. Like, I feel like the actual strategy is going to depend so much on the platform that you're on where your team sits with respect to other teams. If you're on a platform team, I guess I was just thinking back. I was empathizing a little bit with all of these other teams at Twitter that want more dynamic sampling. Because one of the teams I worked at Google was the team that helped basically ran the back end for the Google Cloud Console. And you don't need scientific notation to talk about the number of requests that the Google Cloud Console was handling at the time. It's a lot smaller than the rest of Google. And for like a bunch of complicated reasons, we couldn't use Dapper. And yet we were kind of this, it was a small handful of services that sat between the UI, which gave this very uniform, it's one big happy product, Google Cloud, and like all of the different products that were underneath that umbrella. And we were constantly like getting paged for all of these other different services that weren't our fault. It was just that we were passing through that data in some way. And so for us, it wasn't about like having this like global system diagram. It was just about quickly mapping, like there's a problem for some subset of users. Is it like the quota management or the billing? Because I've got to go page one of those teams or one of the other dozen teams that we provided that umbrella for. And so even for us, like just being able to kind of map inputs to outputs would have been a ton of value. And I don't think, like I said, we couldn't really use Dapper, and maybe if we had the time to invest or some other solution that we could have used off the shelf, we didn't have time to go manage the data itself, but it was a lot of grabbing through logs and doing very manual correlation of failures that we were basically returning to the UI with failures that we were seeing underneath.
I think that brings us to another really important point that actually Jonathan raised as well, that we in the industry hadn't invested heavily in tools for tracing. And in fact, this whole approach where we make it really easy to correlate and cross-reference between different types of monitoring, including tracing. I think we've generally historically done a very poor job at building tools that let us do that, and it's so valuable. I mean, that case you raised, Spoons, I think I have a plan to build a tool like that at Twitter, because that is, people ask for it all the time. It's like, hey, we have these traces, so can't we use this to tell us, which of the services that I depend on 3 hops away has got elevated latency. The operations people who are sort of in charge of the ongoing health of the site, they don't know what this dependency graph looks like. So first of all, we have to build a dependency graph, and then we have to build tools that let us, find answers to questions like that pretty much in real time. And it's kind of, we could have been doing this 10 years ago. I don't know if anybody tried, and maybe there were startups that failed or something. But I think it's kind of unfortunate that there's this or maybe it's an opportunity, a big gap in our toolkit that can save a lot of SRE and operational grief, and reduce the number of pages, or at least get people paged in a more targeted way, and so on.
Yeah, I think a lot about this. Like, there's about where investment kind of goes in these tools. I feel like the investment and the innovation has really pushed so much on the kind of control plane side of things. Like, and I guess maybe there's an easier argument to make, right? Which is like, if you don't have this, Kubernetes configuration management system, then you just can't push out configuration changes, right? It's a sort of like 0 to 1 kind of thing. And it's, I guess, maybe harder, or we haven't done as good of a job in making an argument for like why on the ability to observe what's happening, whether that's through distributed tracing or through other tools or the connections of those tools. Like, having that is like equally important, but it's not quite as clear that like it's a roadblock to running a distributed system, right? Even though, through experience, we've all learned that if you don't have it, it's terrible. But it doesn't necessarily show up on the plan or on the map in the same way.
I mean, to this, I think this is a really interesting discussion. Open Telemetry is sort of, as part of its mission statement, really has said, we want to make high quality, distributed traces and metrics a built-in feature of cloud native software, right? And to that end, there's been a couple of interesting initiatives. One, kind of getting buy-in, I guess you could say, from a lot of traditional, APM monitoring companies. Say, like, yes, we will donate our agents or our automatic instrumentation efforts to Open Telemetry, and try to standardize around those being an open source project, or having a single sort of open source project for that. But 2 is also kind of going the other way and saying, like, okay, well, can we get Open Telemetry to be sort of a checkbox option on a database or on a particular library? So I wonder, is that sort of the path for tools? Like, just go out and say, get it embedded in the frameworks and get it embedded in, the database drivers and kind of call it a day? Or even with that, will there still be a need for a code first way to write traces more easily?
One thing that strikes me from some of this discussion, and I'm curious if you would agree with me on this or not, but there's very much this flavor, and there has been both in industry and in the research community that I belong to, where there's this viewpoint, sort of like, if you build it, they will come. As in, get the data first. Just get the data. That's the problem. And a lot of the focus on, even throughout our conversation here, but through open tracing and open telemetry, we're paying a lot of attention to getting the data. Yet the problems that we're discussing here, that we're sort of highlighting as some of the biggest difficulties that distributed tracing faces, are not related to getting the data. They're related to sort of extracting value from the data. And this, I think, is where there's a vast amount of disparity between, as you said, you see some great demos from companies that have distributed tracing. It's not just because they've invested in instrumentation. It's also because they know what their use cases are and they've built up the tooling around it, and they've sort of started understanding how to put the data to work for them. And I think that this is really something that is likely to change over the next few years for distributed tracing. I'm hoping that we will get more clarity around how we expect to use a lot of this data. And we spoke about this at length in the book, and there's a wide open, there's a gulf, an empty, mixing so many metaphors here. There's plenty of room for new tools to do these sorts of things. Yeah. So I guess summarizing, I can't wait for the day where we can move away from thinking about getting data as being the main challenge.
I think that's a good point. Spoons, Rebecca? Nothing on that one? Let's see. Questions in the chat. Yeah, it's just another question about sampling. Heart emoji, thank you. So, kind of pivot a little bit. For me, at least, this was the first book I've ever had a hand in writing, and I know we kind of have a spectrum of skill levels, but I'd like to kind of take a minute and say, like, what's one thing you learned about writing a book, or just about distributed tracing in general that you didn't know before, hadn't thought of before? I will go first. Writing a book is a lot harder than I thought it would be. Significantly harder than I thought it would be. I thought it'd be like, oh yeah, it's writing. I can write. I write all day. My job is writing. That's what programming a computer is, right? You're just writing, just in like a really weird language. No, books, much harder. A lot more time consuming.
I like that you don't totally remember that it was your idea, Austin.
I've tried to suppress that. I put that into like the back. I pushed that way down. So So on this particular part, yes, it was my idea. I actually went and pitched this. So here's the fun story. When I joined, so I had heard about open tracing before I joined Lightstep, and one of the reasons I joined Lightstep as a company is because I'm very passionate about what they were, the mission, as it were, right? Also because it's like, oh, this would have solved so many of my problems at my last job. I definitely want this. But I go in there, and I remember like day one or day two, I think day one actually, I'm sitting in an onboarding meeting and we're talking about open tracing. I'm like, okay, so I don't have a ton of a background in this. Like I've read the website, I read the Dapper paper. Is there like a book I can read? And everyone was like, no, there's no book. I was like, so how do you learn it? It's like, well, you read the website, you read the paper, and then you just kind of ask people and figure it out. And I was like, okay, there should really be a book. I'm like, yeah, that would be great. Everyone would love a book. Everyone's like, yeah, I love a book. That'd be great. So much to write a book. And then their miscalculation was remembering that or not knowing yet that I remembered things. And then like a few months later, I was at a O'Reilly Velocity in New York City, and I just kind of like, in the back of my mind, I had that like, someone should write a book conversation. And so I go up to the O'Reilly desk, and I just asked the person there, it's like, hey, how does someone like write a book for O'Reilly? And like, well, you talk to like one of these people. I'm like, okay, are they here? Can I talk to them? And they're like, yeah, I'll send them an email. What do you want to write a book about? I'm like, distributed tracing. And they're like, what's distributed tracing? And I was like, okay, so there's going to be some be a process. but yeah, like I went and talked to them, and they were like, "Oh yeah," well, I pitched it in person to like their biz dev guy, their book development guy, and he was like, "This sounds super." This guy's name's John Devins, and he's great. If you ever get a chance to meet him, love him. But John's like, it's like I don't quite. It's like haven't heard of this. I don't know much about this, but you seem very passionate about it, and that's how I believe in it. So go fill out this, write this thing. Basically, give you like a Google Doc that you have to fill out that has like table of contents and like a breakdown and description and a bunch of other stuff. And then they go and send that off, and they talk about it internally, I guess. And then like a week later, it's like, yeah, cool, we're down for it. And then nearly a year and a half later, of a project that I expected to take like 8 months, I think. I think originally I was like, oh, we'll start this in like December and we'll wrap up, or yeah, like November, December, we'll wrap up like March, April, and it took until December?
January,
yeah, January. Yeah, so I pitched this fall of 2018. I thought the book would be out by August of 2019. It came out,
Here we are.
Yeah, here we are today. So it took a little longer than I expected. So that's the other thing I learned. It takes longer than you think. All right, that's enough about that's off my soapbox.
I completely agree with your point about just explaining distributed tracing. I mean, I've had dozens, well, not dozens, about a dozen students, who come in and they're excited about this, that, or the other, and it's like, oh, cool. So what's tracing? And at a certain point, you realize there must be a better way than me having to, map it out on a whiteboard how it works every single time. And there were no books. There were a handful of research papers on this topic, and then it was dive in with open tracing and figure it out for yourself. So there was a clear need for such a book, and I'm happy that we got it done.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was going to ask before, when you started as a PhD student, like what was the thing that convinced you then? Because obviously there was no book way back then.
So my advisor was Rodrigo Fonseca. He wrote a research paper back in 2007 on a system called Xtrace. So for those of you who know your distributed tracing history, in fact, we talk about it in the book. But this is really one of the first distributed tracing systems that there was, and I guess the whole reason that I went back to grad school, I worked for a couple of years in industry, and then I went back for my PhD. The whole reason I went back was because I find large systems super interesting because I don't understand them. Like when a system gets large enough that you don't understand it, it becomes interesting to me. And then when I was talking with Rodrigo about Xtrace, it was just like a match made in heaven. And it was this cool, weird thing. And at the time, I remember distinctly, who was it who told me? Someone from Tracelytics, which was a very early tracing startup, told me how distributed tracing works, and I'm like, that's so cool, but how do you actually get the traces? And they're like, you have to go and change like all of the system's source code. And I was just like, this is fantastic. Like there's so much you can do here. So that's what drew me in.
Cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rebecca. What did you learn in this?
I learned that if you take on the task of doing some writing for a book, you should definitely offload some of your other commitments. I guess I actually found it fascinating reading all of the material that you all produced. I think I learned a lot just from reading the rest of the book, because my journey in tracing has been a little different to, I think, what's normal, what's conventional, and certainly different to each of you, of course. Perhaps I have the most overlap with Jonathan, but yeah, so I found a lot of the early chapters really insightful and clarifying. So that was actually a really nice part of it.
Cool. So we got about 10
I
minutes.
think,
Oh,
oh,
no, Jonathan.
I was just going to add an anecdote, which is
Yeah,
I
go
think
for it. I love anecdotes.
I think this project was responsible for one of the worst meetings in my entire career. Not because of the content of the meeting or the people I was meeting with, but I just have this memory that stands out in my head from last August, where there was this obscene heat wave in Europe, where the temperatures got well in excess of 100 degrees. And of course, in Germany, it doesn't get that hot, so you don't have air conditioning. And you're all on the west coast of the US. And so I remember taking a meeting from my balcony, which was the only place that was the coolest place. Sweat was streaming down my face as we were on video chat talking about the book. And it was my own personal version of hell. So the worst thing about the, sorry?
I was gonna say, I feel like you were drinking a beer at the time, maybe, but
I was drinking beers in most of our meetings on account of the time zone difference.
Yeah.
time zone instead.
Yeah, this is definitely, this whole project was definitely an adventure in meeting scheduling because Jonathan, I'm East Coast US, Jonathan was Germany for most of it, I believe. Spoons and Rebecca are both West Coast US, and then for a little while there, sometimes Jonathan was also in New Zealand, so lots of fun, just fun with calendars. So we got about 10 minutes left. Let's take a few last questions from the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. So the first question from Voss705, building up what Jonathan said about analyzing data, what are your thoughts on visualization tools for analyzing trace data? Whoever.
That's a great question for Jonathan.
Well, I would like to hear your opinions about this. I view this as a research question. To sort of get up on my soapbox, a trace is a data structure. That's what Spoon said at the start of this. It's a complicated data structure. It's a graph with labels and annotations provided by a bunch of different people following no schema or rhyme or reason whatsoever. It can incorporate data from the network stack, as you've done in the past, Rebecca. It's this monster, and so visualizing it, doing any kind of analysis of this data is hard, and visualizing it in some sort of coherent way is really, really challenging. I have no solutions whatsoever. I've written D3 visualizations of my own for traces, and it's just painful. I will say that, again, this comes into the tooling question. A lot of people who come into distributed tracing do so having done instrumentation, having done lots of systems level work with distributed tracing. And I would love to see more people joining some of these open source projects who aren't only interested in the systems level aspect, who are interested in visualization and the usability of the tools that we produce, because I think that's a little bit lacking at the moment. But on the other hand, it's not an easy thing to solve. So I have a student who's working on visualization stuff right now, and we're integrating all of our prototypes with Jaeger, and we're planning to figure out some way of having like an experimental section for sort of visualization, tooling for comparative analysis, and that sort of thing.
That's really great. Yeah, we need that.
That's the plan.
I've actually been working with a UI specialist who's right at the intersection of systems data and visualization tools, and that's been a journey of discovery for both of us. But we worked particularly on visualizing service dependencies using data extracted from traces, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the visualization to get more insights. I did not appreciate how much additional insight we'd be able to get just from having this visualization. So we haven't really, I don't know how far we're going to go with making this public, but my colleague Dan Liu has a blog it's danluu.com, and he wrote a blog post on tracing. Okay, well, check out his recent post about tracing. Sort of down the bottom part of it is basically a sneak preview of this tool that Yuri, who's the UI guy, developed, and I actually think it's pretty exciting. You know, we're just getting started. I'm hoping that us at Twitter, but also lots of other people, that we're sort of on the verge of really pushing the envelope with visualizations. So what we can do.
Yeah, your comment here about you don't quite realize how much is there until you build a visualization and you're like, whoa, like it's showing me all this stuff I didn't even realize. It's this happened to me when I was building some of the tools for my PhD. It happened with some of the viz stuff that I was working on at Facebook. It happened with one of my current students only a few months ago, who's working on dynamic program analysis for figuring out how to do context propagation automatically. You visualize this stuff and you're like, awesome. Yeah.
Well, cool. So we're actually just about out of time. So if you had a question that we didn't answer on stream, then I would encourage you to pick up a copy of the book, because we probably answer it in there, or at least have an opinion on it. And if you would like to get a copy of the book for the low cost of free, make sure you check out this URL down here at the bottom of your screen, bit.ly/tracing-book-giveaway, and you could be entered to win a copy of Distributed Tracing in Practice, thanks to our generous sponsors, Lightstep, who, in addition to paying my salary, are also sponsoring this book giveaway. With that said, I think final thoughts. Let's take it home, starting with Jonathan.
Final thoughts. We have a long way to go, but it is a very, very good idea to think about investing in distributed tracing now. We're at the point where the long-term benefits will already outweigh the cost that goes into instrumenting your systems. And the benefits are only going to grow as things get more mature.
Cool. Rebecca?
Yep. Also, as things get more integrated, I think that's another angle that I can see progressing a lot in the near future.
Spoons?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, like that as distributed tracing can kind of plug in or interact or integrate with or kind of multiply other tools. I think there's a lot of benefit there. I feel like I was saying that like offering the value and the benefits to people that are just getting started that's to me like one of the biggest hurdles. And if we can bring it close to where they're already working, workflows they're already familiar with, there's a long way to it'll take us a long way if we can get there.
Yeah. And I guess I'll start out the kind of way I started. I wanted to write the book that didn't exist when I was trying to learn this, because I truly believe that this is one of the best tools in the toolbox of like trying to, as a developer or SRE or DevOps person or whatever, as someone whose job it is to like interact with computers or distributed systems, like distributed tracing is the key to saving you so much headache. Now it might replace those headaches with other headaches, but those new headaches will be smaller headaches than the ones you would have without it. That's my 2 cents. I feel like, try it out, right? You might like it. So yeah. Oh, keep in mind also, if you don't win a copy and you buy a copy, keep in mind all royalties of all proceeds or all royalties of the book sales actually don't go to us. We don't get anything from this other than you getting knowledge filled into your head. All royalties go to the Anita Borg Foundation, I believe, right? Yeah. So we're donating 100% of royalties to charity for the life of the book. Because Why not, right? Good to give back. With that said, it's been an hour. Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for attending. This video will be up on demand for you to watch later or send it around to your friends. Keep an eye on the Deserted Island DevOps page at desertedislanddevops.com for more upcoming events. Follow us, twitch.tv/OnCallMeMaybe for more fun things like this, and also sort of bi-weekly programming, tracing, observability tutorials and streams. And you can find me on Twitter at Austin L. Parker, Jonathan at MPI_JC Mace. Spoons is at save_spoons.
I love that handle.
It's really good. And then I can't remember which way cameras go, and then Rebecca has elected to not.
I just, sorry, I didn't think of it. I have a handle, I can't remember what it is.
Well, if you want to find that out, I'm sure we can help you find that out.
I think I follow Jonathan.
You probably follow Jonathan. If you follow Jonathan, you'll figure it out eventually.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.